Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do one of my favorite videos, and that is that if you like this, then you should read that. I have done many of these videos before. This one is focused on horror, and I have done previous ones on the genre as well as other genres, so definitely go and check those out as well. I'm going to have a list in the description box as well as up in the cards. And today I have some really good pairings, hopefully some great recommendations. I am trying for the most part to pair popular books with less popular ones, but as always, these recommendations for the most part do work in both directions. So if you've read the less popular one, go ahead and read the other one that I'm comparing it to. Hopefully you will find something here to check out, and let's get started. First, let's talk about House of Leaves by Mark Z. Denzalewski, and I will admit that most people who have read this book will argue that nothing that they will ever read will quite compare to this reading experience because it is incredibly unique. This book is a book within a book. It involves a house that appears to be larger on the inside than the outside, and it is so complex. And of course, if you're familiar with it, it's one that you typically want to physically read because the writing itself is very unique. It's kind of done in a multimedia format where different sections are written in different directions, and let's see if I can find, there's places where there's just a few words on the page, and it's a very psychological horror book, largely because of the way that it is written and that formatting. And I think for those that love this book, they really love it because of those reasons. So I want to recommend a book that is actually not horror. So yes, I'm starting off this video by cheating, but I do think that if you like House of Leaves and are looking for something somewhat close to that experience. Again, I don't think anything is going to exactly replicate that. I'm actually going to point you in the direction of a science fiction book, but it's one that I think will appeal again to those of you that love aspects of this one, because while it's science fiction, it's very approachable, and specifically, I think that it's very intellectual and psychological. So the book that I want to recommend is called XX by Ryan Hughes, and this is a story that involves first contact with aliens, and at the beginning of the story, Earth begins to have some communication with what might be alien life. The story is told over multiple perspectives, but primarily we follow a young man who is potentially neurodiverse. He shows elements of possibly being autistic or OCD or somewhere on the different spectrums of neurodiversity. And he is both brilliant but also very quirky. And within the way his mind works, because it appears to be wired differently, he starts to see connections and possibly different ways that the aliens are communicating. I don't want to spoil too much, but the author himself really leans into the multimedia format because this book is also formatted very similarly to the House of Leaves. And I do have a physical copy just to show you here, as you kind of have to see it for yourself. So without spoiling too much, you're going to see pictures and so graphics, and then pages where you'll just have, things being repeated over the page and so forth. And it's very interesting. The author is someone with a background in graphic design as well as typography, and that is very clearly shown in this book. And so again, if you like the formatting aspect of House of Leaves, I think that this book will really appeal to you as well. Within the science fiction book, I think that it really draws from a lot of ideas involving how we communicate and what meaning we draw from signs and type and different things like that. And so I will admit that this book is not scary, but it definitely still has a psychological aspect to it. It is very smart and very immersive. And so if you like those kind of books, I really think you should try the other one, because I do think that these are as good a pairing as I'm ever going to get to House of Leaves. I will be shocked if I'm able to bring it back in another "if you like this, try that" video, because the fact that I found one book that I feel comfortable to compare it to is quite surprising in and of itself. Next, I want to do a comparison for The Haunted by Bentley Little, which is a book I've talked about before. It's a very classic haunted house story about a family that move into a new home. It seems too good to be true, the price is right, but once they move in, things start to go terribly wrong, and the home appears to have a psychological effect on the family. Now, if you're not aware, Bentley Little is one I've talked about on my channel before. He is an author that is very unique in style. He tends to write with a bit of satire and is very self-aware of the horror genre, but he also likes to write very weird or uncomfortable stories. So the way that he writes psychological horror is often tied in with elements of sexual horror. And so he writes the characters just being very sexually aroused in very inappropriate places and doing things that are just plain wrong, but because they are potentially underneath the influence of this outside force, you explain away what they're doing, but it makes for a very uncomfortable reading experience. He is not for everyone, but I personally do enjoy his stories. And so I want to recommend a story. It's not necessarily a haunted house story, but it does have similar feelings and themes. And so the one I want to talk about today is The Wicked by James Newman. This is about a family that moved to a new town to get a fresh start. The family had a horrific event happen to them and are now trying to move on. Little do they know that there is possibly an ancient evil controlling this town, and soon enough that ancient evil starts to have a psychological effect on the family. So again, this is less about a haunted house, but I think that it plays into a lot of the similar ideas of it because again, it has that influence where the characters are just not quite acting right. They are acting really inappropriate. And as the story goes on, you start to wonder if something more is going on, or are they just really despicable people? And slowly the story gets worse and worse. And I do think, again, it's one that's very uncomfortable. It has some sexually explicit horror in it, nothing too over the top, but definitely enough to make you very uncomfortable. And so if you like horror stories that play on that psychological level and can be very inappropriate, but also very fun, this one definitely makes lots of nods to the horror of the 1980s. And so if you're looking to reproduce that experience, this is one that in my opinion is a little bit more underhyped, but definitely worth your time. Next up, I want to talk about Chasing the Boogeyman by Richard Chizmar. And this is a story that is technically more of a horror thriller or even a mystery, and it's also a coming-of-age story. It follows the author in this fictional setting where he is growing up in a town where there was a serial killer. And throughout his childhood, he is watching these young women disappear, and the police try to investigate and figure out who it is. And then it follows him into adulthood, and you know by the end of the story, the serial killer is revealed to the reader. But within the story, as I mentioned, it's also a coming-of-age story because it really deals with him growing up and just moving through life into adulthood. But what I want to hone in for specifically this video is the fact that this book is incredibly meta and self-aware because the author, while this is technically fiction and it is sold as fiction, the author Richard Chizmar is a character within the story and it is written as if it is a true memoir. And the author goes so far as to take as many real elements of his real life and infuse them into the story so that it gets very confusing and very murky as to what is fiction and what is fact. And for me, I love that aspect of the story, and so I want to recommend a book that had a similar concept behind it. And so I want to recommend Red X by David Demchak, which is a story set in the 1970s and 80s leading up to the current day of Toronto, Canada, a city that has a horrible reputation. For years ago, there was a situation where there were young gay men that were disappearing out of the city and the police were doing very little about it. Sadly, to this day, many of those disappearances are still unresolved. And so the author takes his true experience because he was also a young man living in Toronto and seeing these people disappear. And so he took that narrative and then turned it into a horror story. So he brings in the element of, well, was it a serial killer? Did those guys just run away? Or was something supernatural going on? But what I like, again, is that this book is so crazy meta. It goes to the point that the author will stop the storytelling at various points in time, break the fourth wall, and start discussing his own personal aspect of the story, how he fits in, what he remembers, his growing up, his childhood, his family, his personal struggles. And it is so honest and so raw, but then it's told within a story that is, again, marketed as being fiction. And so it's a story where, you cannot tell where that line is. And it's almost more terrifying because of the fact that so much of the fiction could be truth and that there is truth woven throughout the story. So again, if you love those aspects of Chasing the Boogeyman, you will find it once again in this story. Both are horrifying in their own rights. Both are very psychological, and I love them both for similar reasons and different reasons, but both, regardless, are definitely worth your time. Next, I want to talk about When the Reckoning Comes by Latanya McQueen. And this is a story that follows a Black character. It is an own voice Voices story, where it is following a young woman who is returning back to her hometown where she is left. She is only returning because one of her childhood friends is getting married, and she's very reluctant to go back. Her friend is getting married at the site that used to be a place of slavery, and so it just feels very off going back. The friendship broke down years ago, and she just wants to leave that history behind. This is technically a horror story, so it goes to some horrifying places by the end. And perhaps compared to a lot of these books on this list, this one is a lot more underhyped, but I had a really good pairing for it. So even if you haven't read this one, I would still recommend, again, the two. If they sound good, read them both, etc. The other book I want to talk about is Queen of the Cicadas by V. Castro. And this story follows a young Mexican woman who is going to the site of a wedding as well. She is reluctant to do so for, again, various reasons. There's a lot of history that she wants to leave behind, but she decides to go there. And in doing so, she has to deal with not only her personal past, but the past of that time period, because again, it deals with a lot of very serious racial issues. This one is told over multiple points of view, so you get to have the present day and the past. And you can probably tell from the synopsis why I'm pairing these two books together. Both stories, of course, are written by Own Voices authors, of course, one being Black and one being of Mexican descent. But within that, you get those perspectives and some really great themes surrounding racial tension and good commentary, as well as presenting strong female characters that have difficult histories. And so I just found the stories to be similar. And so again, I think if you have read one, you definitely should check out the other. And if both just sound good, you haven't read either, that is a perfect excuse to read two books. So hopefully I can put something on your TBR today. Finally, I want to recommend two horror thrillers. The first one being Final Girls by Riley Sager, which was his debut novel and one of my personal favorites. This one follows a girl who years ago survived a terrible massacre. She was a sole survivor and to this day is still dealing with the fallout. Now in the present, she is trying to move on. She is a baker, she has a significant other, and is just trying to put the past behind her. However, over the years, in order to cope, she made friends with other people that were involved in being final girls in other situations, and so they made this friendship. At the beginning of the story, one of them dies, and so they reach out, the remaining ones, together, and because of this, she has to revisit her past once more, and eventually they start to find out what happened all those many years ago. Now, I want to compare this to Disturbed by Jennifer Janes, and this is a thriller with elements of horror again that has a very similar premise. This one follows a girl who, again, years ago was a survivor of a massacre, which I believe happened on Halloween, and she's the only one to survive. Obviously is horribly traumatized by what happened, but again is trying to move on. However, someone is catching up with her and reminding her of her past. She is getting notes on her car, and the past just will not stay hidden. And so this book, once again, I felt like dealt with the themes of being a final girl, what that means, the trauma, and the fact that you just never really leave it behind. I thought it had some good twists and turns, and in my opinion is a thriller that is much more underhyped. I suspect a lot of you, if you have not read Final Girls by Riley Sager, at least are aware of it, but hopefully the second one is, again, one that's a little bit more underhyped and something that I can put on your radar. I thought both books had some great twists and turns, some great female character representation, and were just plain a lot of fun. So that is it for this video here. I would love to hear of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out? Don't forget that if you want even more recommendations, you can check out my playlist, which is linked in the cards and description box, not just for horror, but also science fiction and thrillers. As well, if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. And if you're looking for even more recommendations, maybe there's a book that you just finished reading you absolutely loved and are looking for a read alike, let me know down below with a request in the comments, and I'll do my best to try to find a book to compare it to in a future video. If you want to help me out, you can give this video a thumbs up, share it around online, and hit that little notification bell so you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.